Good morning, everyone. I am Iris Wilbur-Glick, GLI's Vice President of Public Policy and External Affairs. I know many of you are actively signing on as we speak and connecting audio. And so let's go ahead and get to it. And I know many of you are continuing to sign in here. So thanks again for joining us today for this installment of GLI's Capital Connection Series presented by Norton Healthcare. We appreciate everyone's flexibility with the rescheduling of this event from September 23rd. We have long been looking forward to this important conversation just because of all the headlines, and we know many of you are actively making arrangements, we hope, to participate in this November's election. So we are grateful to have with us today Kentucky Secretary of State Michael Adams regarding this November's election. Some of you may recall that we hosted Secretary Adams earlier this year ahead of the primary election. So we're thrilled to have him back again. And we have a whole round of questions that we have prepared and many of you have pre-submitted. So we greatly appreciate his office's engagement with the business community and thank him for his time. Given the challenges Kentucky and our nation are facing, direct engagement between public and private sector leaders has never been more important. And we are so grateful to have this opportunity and for the Secretary to always keep his door open for us. So while GLI does not make political endorsements or we do not directly get involved in campaigns for public office, what we do strongly encourage from our membership in the greater business community is to vote, to be engaged in the electoral process and be as educated as possible when filling out their ballots. So this year, it is equally as important that they understand the different options available to them as they fill out their ballot and understand the steps that state leaders like Secretary Adams are taking to keep our elections safe and secure and protect public health. So conversations like today are one that we're having as part of GLI's efforts to keep our membership informed and up to date. GLI members can learn more about the November elections on greaterlouisville.com, where you will find summaries of the options available to Kentucky voters, as well as the results of our 2020 candidate survey. So just click the Advocacy tab at the website to access all of these resources. On the call this morning, we will participate in about a 45-minute program. Following Secretary Adams' remarks, GLI's Director of Public Policy Development, Charles Aul, will facilitate a Q&A. To ask a question during the portion of today's call, we ask that you utilize the Zoom chat feature located at the bottom of your screen. With that, I would like to thank our sponsors who make conversations like today very much possible for GLI. So we have presenting sponsor Norton Healthcare, and supporting sponsors Babbage Co-founder and Crown Castle. So with that, I would now like to turn things over to my friend Riggs Lewis of Norton Healthcare.
Thank you, Iris. Can you hear me? I want to make sure my technology is working. Great. Thanks to GLI for another timely conversation. And Secretary Adams, I've known you a long time. On behalf of Norton Healthcare, what you've done, and for those who don't know what's happened, COVID-19 changed everything in our industry at healthcare. Every business has had to adjust, but for those who aren't quite aware, what Secretary Adams and the county clerks, 120 in Kentucky, have had to do is rebuild the election process with constitutional rights, timing, legalities, to rebuild our election process so that it is safer under COVID-19 and it is legal. And they proved that concept, painting the plane while it flies, in the primary. But that's only a partial demonstration of what's coming in November. So on behalf of Norton Healthcare, we want to thank you because behind me, we have a website called Engage, engage.nortonhealthcare.org. It is a national website that we've worked with a national vendor to make sure that our 16,500 employees in Indiana and Kentucky can know about the candidates, register to vote, vote absentee, and vote early. And none of that can be possible without Secretary Adams working in a bipartisan way to make the election process work. This website is open to anyone who wants to use it. It's for our employees, but it's open source. You can visit it anytime, but you can see the information. I can find out where my polling locations are, both early voting and on election day. So Secretary Adams, it has been a Herculean effort by your office. Thank you. So I want to turn this over to Michael Adams, our Secretary of State, who was elected this November, was given a task that many thought nationally couldn't be done. He's done it, Mr. Secretary.
Well, thank you so much, Riggs, and thank you, Iris, for those introductory comments. I want to tell you the biggest challenge I've got right now, it's not vote suppression or vote fraud or even really the pandemic. It's getting information to the electorate about all the great options they've got to vote and how to exercise those options. It's literally never been easier in Kentucky history to vote in 200 years than it is in 2020. I'm really proud of that. But all that good news isn't useful if people don't receive it. So I'm especially grateful to GLI and our sponsors today for helping me get this information out to voters to know how they can participate. GLI has done a great job when I was a candidate last year, surveying me and my opponent and other candidates and getting our messages out to people on questions of interest to your members. And I appreciate the great role you all play as public citizens in this regard. Let me start with this. I think the best way to kick off is to tell you what's changed from the primary. The primary, I'm happy to say, was not just a success by my lights, but nationally recognized across America as the best election conducted in the pandemic. As a rookie who just got here, I'm really proud of that. I'm proud of the bipartisan work that the governor and I, our State Board of Elections, and our county clerks engaged in together in good faith to make sure we had a successful and a safe election. And the results were we had very high turnout, very active participation, almost a record in primary turnout. We had no spike in COVID-19 cases, which I'm very pleased about, despite hundreds of thousands of voters voting in person. And we had no vote fraud. There were also predictions of that. They turned out to be spurious. Even though we expanded voting and made it more available and much easier, we also supervised it closely, surveilled the system, and ensured that we had a fair and free election without fraud. All of that said, what the governor and I agreed to pretty soon after the primary was we wanted to keep what worked and try to improve what could be improved. And I think we've done that. I think we're on track for even a more successful election in November than we had in June. So here's what we changed. Number one, we've scaled back the degree of absentee voting. It's still there. It's something that's available if you need it. Our state constitution calls for elections to be held at the polls. But since 1945, our state constitution has explicitly recognized the right to vote absentee. This is not something that I invented. This has been around for 75 years in our constitution as a right. All I've done is make it easier. Today at midnight is the deadline to request an absentee ballot if that's how you choose to vote. And that's something that you can mail back at our expense. We're paying for your postage. Or if you like, you can drop it in the drop box. We spent about $600,000 here in Frankfort buying drop boxes for all the county clerks so they can distribute them around their counties. These things are like tanks. They're impenetrable. You can't blow them up. You can't pour stuff in them. You can't steal them. They're much more secure than mailboxes. That's how the governor and the lieutenant governor voted, is they dropped absentee ballots in the drop box. That's how I voted in the primary. This is another option for you if you want the personal satisfaction of dropping your ballot in the bin and knowing it's been received. But regardless, if you request your ballot at govoteky.com, you can track it even if you mail it back. We have a 24/7 transparency on ballots. You apply for a ballot there based on your age or health condition. You don't have to give us any specifics, but if you subjectively decide that based on your age or health, or for that matter, if you're out of town on election day, you want to vote absentee, there you go. Once you apply for that ballot, it's processed, it's sent to you, and then you send it back, and you can track this ballot the way you track an Amazon package at govoteky.com. It's pretty nifty. This is a new reform that we've introduced this year. But all that said, in the primary, the governor and I pressed every voter, if possible, to vote that way because of the significant reduction of in-person voting options that we were able to make available due to our poll workers canceling on short notice. This time, we've done a much better job finding poll workers. So we've scaled back absentee voting to make sure we don't crash our system. We had 29% turnout in the primary. That's really good for a Kentucky primary, 29%. My anticipation is 72% turnout in the November election. We can't have 2.5 times the number of absentee ballots that we had in the primary. If we did, we'd crash our system. Our clerks can't manage that sort of volume. Our infrastructure is just not designed for that in a state where usually 2% vote absentee. So the governor and I agreed to preserve absentee voting for those who need it, and we trust you to make that decision. I don't make it, and your clerk doesn't make it. At the same time, the release valve for election day to ensure we don't have overcrowding and people getting sick, this time is going to be in-person early voting. So the second thing that we've changed is we've expanded in-person voting in 2 ways. Number one, we've had much greater success in finding both locations and poll workers for the general election compared with our primary. On March 6th, the day that the first COVID-19 case was diagnosed in our state, we had about 15,000 poll workers ready to go. 2 weeks later, the deadline for poll workers to register, we had about 2,000 poll workers. The bottom dropped out. I actually testified last year to the legislature before I was sworn in that we have a poll worker crisis in our state. Our greatest generation are baby boomers. They're aging out over time to be poll workers. They're very community-oriented, civic-minded generations. And unfortunately, my generation, Gen X, hasn't stepped up the way we need to. And so I've spent the last 3 months beating the drum around the state to find new poll workers. This is really the job of the county clerks by law, but I've stepped up with my team to help, and we've found 5,000 poll workers just by ourselves in our office through active recruitment. That's helped us add many more locations. In Jefferson County, for example, we're going from 1 location in June to now 20 locations on November 3rd. But here's even better news, I think. This year, there's no such thing as election day. There's election days. There are a lot of calls to lengthen the polling hours on November 3rd, and I agree with that. But I've got a better solution. Let's have more than 1 day to vote. So we actually have 19 days where you can vote in person this year. 3 full weeks, 6 days a week with the polls open, plus, of course, November 3rd. So starting this coming Tuesday, October 13th, during regular business hours, we have in Jefferson County 4 locations, but across the state, at least 1 location in every county for early in-person voting. This process is exactly the same as voting on November 3rd, except the lines are going to be a lot shorter. If you show up and vote early, it's the same process. You bring your photo ID that's due to a new law we now have on the books in Kentucky that I championed. But it's the same process as on November 3rd. Your vote is handled with the exact same protocols. It just helps us space out the lines and ensure we don't have crowds, and we want to maintain social distancing. It also, frankly, increases the convenience of the voter, obviously. So we're going to have, during regular business hours on weekdays, it depends on your county, obviously, what those hours are specifically. You can find out at sos.ky.gov the specifics of your county plan. But business hours on weekdays plus at least a half day on Saturdays, bare minimum that we've required statewide. This is going to facilitate voter access and also reduce the crowds on November 3rd. Let me give you one last change that we've made I'm really proud of. The big pieces of feedback I got from the primary was, number one, people wanted more places to go vote. So we've done that. The other item of feedback was people want to know the results on election night. Every state that's voted since, say, the 1st of April, with this pandemic in the background, every state, including us, has taken at least a week to process all the votes and release the results. New York voted the same day that we did, June 23rd. We took a week to count the ballots. It took about 2 months. Here's what we've changed to try to even tighten that week down as much as possible. 2 things. Number one, we're pivoting to most of our voting being in person. We proved that we can do this safely in the primary. In the primary, 75% of our voters voted absentee, and that was great for the time. But my expectation is about 1/3 will vote absentee in the general election and 2/3 will vote in person. That means we can count the votes faster. When people vote in person, we push a button on the machine and there's the totals. And we usually are one of the first states in America to put our points on the board on election night of who we voted for. And I think we will be this time too. But we can do that because most of our voters vote in person. But also we're requiring the county clerks to process the absentee ballots they've received as of election day and report those on election night. This has been made possible by the fact that we opened the portal earlier and have closing it earlier this time. So we can phase the different models of the election in different stages and relieve pressure on the clerks to do multiple things at the same time. That's why we're closing the absentee ballot portal tonight at midnight. So we finish that phase of the election, the clerks can move on to opening up in-person voting for 3 weeks. But the fact that we're able to process the ballots faster and in real time as they're received back means that on election night, they can push a button for their absentee votes too. And my guess is we'll have 80% of the vote counted election night. It won't be every vote. We never have every vote in on election night. There's always a delay here or there. But I think we'll have enough votes in election night to actually let the networks be able to call races and provide some finality to the candidates and of course, to the voters. Let me just, again, tell you the deadlines tonight. October 9th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time, that's when we close absentee balloting, close the request process for absentee balloting. So if you want to vote absentee, go ahead and request that ballot at govoteky.com. You can also call the clerk, but we recommend you use the website so you have the ability to track your ballot electronically throughout the process, and also to reduce their call volume at the clerk's office. October 13th, that's Tuesday. That's the first day of 19 days of in-person voting. That's hundreds and hundreds of hours of the polls being open. I like to see the polls open longer on election day going forward, but this is a much bigger deal. It's going to be like 200 hours the polls are going to be open. Anyone who wants to vote is going to have all opportunity to vote, even Saturday hours. So starting the 13th, you can go vote in person. And of course, November 3rd is election day. That's the last day of voting this year. That's the last day at 6 o'clock to be in line to vote in person. It's the last moment to drop your absentee ballot in the drop box, 6 p.m. on November 3rd. That's also the last day that you can mail back an absentee ballot. But if you choose to return your ballot by mail, I do encourage you not to wait until the last minute. Here's why. We've seen delays with the post office. I'm not going to pick on them, but they've fessed up that they've got problems, and there's delays, and we've had issues with them in the past. And so if you mail back your ballot election day and we don't get it within 3 days, we don't get to count it. I don't want you to be disenfranchised by a third party because they took 4 days to deliver your ballot. Number two, we can't count your ballot 2 days or 3 days after the election unless it's postmarked election day or earlier. We've tried to get the post office to postmark election mail. Some of our postmasters around the state are cooperating and some are not. In any event, if it's not postmarked and we get it 2 days or 3 days after the election, we can't count it. It's got to be postmarked. And the general practice of the post office is not to postmark prepaid postage mail. So again, you're taking your chances if you wait till the last minute. If you're still deciding who you want to vote for, by all means, please do that. Get informed, take your time, make a good decision. But if you know who you're going to vote for, which 90% plus of voters typically do, then go ahead and vote. Go ahead and vote early in person, or go ahead and get your absentee ballot back to us. And the sooner you get it back to us, the sooner it's processed and the greater likelihood it's actually part of the count on election night, and we'll have more votes to report to the public. So with all that, I'll turn it back over to you all, and happy to take any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary Adams, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Charles All. I am GLI's Director of Public Policy Development. I'm going to help facilitate some Q&A here this afternoon. As Iris mentioned at the top of the call, there's a couple of ways you can ask questions for Secretary Adams. You can use the Q&A feature, you can use the chat feature. So feel free to submit questions through those formats, and I'll be sure to ask them. But we've also had numerous questions pre-submitted by GLI members, and Secretary Adams, we kind of have a mixture of sort of logistical voting questions, some policy questions, and a little bit of politics too. So we'll try to cover as much ground as we possibly can. I want to start with these voting logistics questions because they're probably, well, I think they're the most pressing thing right now. And let's start with a question about absentee ballots, which a question in the chat hit on this. If I've requested an absentee ballot by mail, but then I change my mind and decide I want to go vote on election day, or maybe I want to try out early voting, can I do that?
Well, the short answer is we discourage that. Elections are about making decisions. So make a decision, make a plan to vote, decide what's right for you. If you requested an absentee ballot because of concern about COVID-19, I don't think you're going to stop having that concern in the next 3 weeks. So pick a method and vote and stick to it. All you're going to do is make life harder for your clerk and for other voters if you request a ballot and then show up and try to vote in person and you're not on the rolls, and then you got to fill out paperwork to cancel your ballot, and it's just going to create more of a gridlock at the polls. So we're actively discouraging that. Now, if you apply for a ballot and you don't get it, okay, that we understand. If you apply for a ballot, you've not gotten it by the 20th of October, then we'll make allowances for you to be able to vote in person. But we don't want people requesting multiple ballots, obviously. So just make a decision. If you decide after you get your absentee ballot that you now don't trust the mail system, well, then drop it in the drop box. It's just like voting in person, except there's no line. So just drop your ballot in the drop box.
So you mentioned that we have 20 locations here in Jefferson. I live in Germantown. Can I go and vote at any of these locations that I prefer?
That's right. These are what's called vote centers. And this is a really interesting idea that I actually proposed in legislation before the pandemic. The idea is, I've been in politics professionally for a quarter century, and I can't tell you how many times, literally every election, I'll get a call from a voter who's turned away on election day because they're in the wrong precinct. They moved or whatever it is, and they're in the wrong precinct. We have a 19th century style of elections where everyone's got to vote in a certain precinct. With vote centers, you can live anywhere in the county and vote anywhere in the county. So if you live in PRP and you work downtown, you want to vote at the Yum Center, then you can vote at the Yum Center. I live in Eastern Jefferson County. On Tuesday morning, I'm going to go vote at the Louisville Marriott off of Hurstbourne. Normally, I vote at the Jewish Temple on 42, but I can vote anywhere. I can go anywhere in the county and vote. This helps us in several ways. Number one, it's very convenient for the voters to be able to go to anywhere in the county and vote versus having to go to the right precinct. Number two, this helps us conserve tax dollars. It's a much more efficient way to run the election, and it requires fewer poll workers. So we did this really because of the pandemic, but maybe we can do this on a permanent basis, at least on a voluntary basis with counties, letting them consolidate some of their voting locations. The voters love it. The voters love the convenience of being able to go where it's convenient for them versus being put in some arbitrary precinct that was written 200 years ago.
So on that same topic, we have a question here in the chat. Obviously we have different legislative districts. We have different metro council districts. I presume if you go to any of these polling places, they'll have everything they need. Whatever district you're in, you're good to go.
That's right. There's hundreds of ballot faces in Jefferson County. You've got lots of I live in Thornhill. So it's a little tiny subdivision town with a city council and a mayor and so forth. When I go vote, they got to have the exact right ballot face for me. Otherwise, I can't vote in Thornhill, and someone else could. But we've addressed that already. We've got adequate ballots for every ballot face at each of these vote locations. And also, we've got the ability to print ballots on demand. We've significantly improved our technology in the last 9 months since I took over. Let me pivot just for a second, talk about this. I'm really proud of this. When I took office in January, we had 27 counties that had no capacity for paper balloting and therefore a paper trail. No matter what your politics, it's in your interest to have paper ballots so we can have a paper trail. If there's ever allegations of hacking or fraud or even just a need for a recount, it's good to have paper ballots that we can go back and verify. We've been very vigorous applying for federal grants and working with counties to upgrade their equipment. So one of the features of all this is we have the ability, not just now in all 120 counties, for voters to have a paper ballot if they choose, but also the ability to, in many cases, print on demand. So any voter from any precinct can easily vote at any place in the county.
This is one of those things that is happening behind the scenes, and the logistics of it make my head spin just thinking about that. So kudos to you and your team for making all that work. Another good question here in the chat. I'm sure this person's asking on behalf of a friend, but let's say you accidentally damaged your absentee ballot in some form or another, maybe the envelope, maybe the ballot itself. can you request a second one?
Well, you can, but don't use the portal. Then it'll come through as a duplication. Just visit your county clerk's office and they can take care of that for you.
Great.
Yeah.
One more logistical question, then we'll get into some policy-oriented talk. If you have signed up to be a poll worker and you haven't heard back yet on training or just any additional information, do you have a sense of the timeline or how that process works?
Well, it varies by county. Some of the counties, I put out a press release at the first of the week. I announced how many poll workers each county had found through our portal at govoteky.com. And some counties have a surplus and some have a deficit. It really just depends. Jefferson should be in great shape. Just through our website and our recruiting alone, we found 1,341 poll workers. That's going to be enough for 20 locations, even though some of these locations are not just one precinct. They're huge vote centers with lots of voting stations in them and lots of poll workers checking people in, not just four as usual at a precinct. But the bottom line is, yeah, we think in Jefferson County we've got enough workers, but it's always good to have alternates. So we still encourage people to sign up because some counties, look, they're fine. They got all they need. They're set. Other counties still need some help. I signed off on Monroe and Owsley County's plans reluctantly this week. We only found 4 poll workers in Monroe and 2 in Owsley through our efforts. It's going to be a little tight there. So we always need help. We always need alternates. But I don't think we're going to have a situation like they had in Wisconsin where they had to close voting locations on election day because the poll workers didn't show up. I think we have enough alternates that will be okay.
Great. Let's jump into some policy questions. Folks on the call, if you have more of these logistics questions, please don't hesitate to add them into the chat. I want to start with foreign interference. This is obviously something that's on a lot of people's mind. We've been hearing about it in national media, and I think a lot of people just think about it from time to time. What's your perspective on the threat to Kentucky's election system from foreign interference, and what steps are we taking to get in front of that?
Well, I'm not able to talk about anything that's classified, obviously. I'll keep it really general. I'll put it this way. We've had our doorknob rattled routinely before and after I took office. We have foreign interests. I won't speak to who they are specifically. That have tested our vulnerabilities. To date, we have not had any breach. I'm really proud of that. We've got a very sophisticated, multi-layered system. I'm in routine contact with federal authorities on the intelligence side to make sure that we get information and that we share information. It's a two-way partnership. I've also worked with our county clerk's offices and county governments to help facilitate them building their own direct relationships with our federal partners to make sure that they're also information sharing. I'm very confident we're going to have an election that is free from foreign interference with regard to tampering with our machines or our counting. We do not connect our election machines to the internet. There's no way for a foreign power, or for that matter, a domestic power or prankster or a candidate or anyone else to hack in electronically and change the totals. There's a myth out there that because we have a website where we put up election results that therefore it can be hacked and changed. Well, even if that website were hacked, that website is downstream from the actual count. The website doesn't count the votes. We count the votes in our office. We actually, this is a little cheesy, but the fact is the counties fax us their totals. We've got a fax machine in our office, and that's how we get the numbers. And then we add them up in the Secretary of State's office. They're not tabulated by a master computer on the internet that anyone can just get into. So we have this process secured. One of the advantages of a decentralized process, I don't actually really run the elections. We have 120 elections on election day. Each county has its own election. And of course, I'm at the center of the wheel among all the spokes. But it's really difficult for anyone to get in at any level and change anything. And part of that is because we have a decentralized system.
Great. Let's talk a little bit about, we've made all these changes here in 2020, and you touched on this a little bit already, but are there certain things that we're starting to do now that you do see potentially becoming permanent?
25, I think it is, days is survival. And I really haven't had a chance to sit down with my own team, let alone legislators, and talk about 2021 yet. I think we'll be in a better position to do that when we finish this election. And I think we'll just have better information about what we need to change going forward. I do intend to go to the legislature with another reform package and offer suggestions for improvement. I'll be very candid with your audience. I don't have a lot of optimism for a lot of permanent expansion of voter ease. I'm kind of persona non grata right now within my party for making it safe to vote in a pandemic. So you can imagine what the receipt would be I'd get if I asked to make this stuff permanent. But I think there's some shot for some parts of this to be made permanent. Here's a really important point. Historically, and again, I've been in politics for 25 years, every election like clockwork, 2% have voted absentee and 98% have voted in person. I don't think we're going to go back to 2% absentee in at least the next 10 years, maybe my lifetime, because way more than 2% of voters qualify to vote absentee based on their age, their health, whatever it is. We've got about a dozen provisions in our law already for people to vote absentee, but they don't utilize it. I've actually proposed legislation to expand it, not infinitely, but medical professionals, first responders, and so forth, to give them the option to vote absentee too. But in any event, I don't think we're going back to 2%, because now 75% of our primary electorate used absentee ballots and they loved it. And I think they partly loved it because we showed that it was secure, and we tightened the security protocols on it with the portal that allows me to surveil the system and ensure we don't have lost or stolen ballots. But we show people that it works, it's secure, that it's secret. And so it's a lot more popular than it was. It's less unfamiliar. So I think we're going to have bigger demand for that going forward. So we need to keep the portal. I'm going to ask the legislature to make the portal permanent. But again, the portal doesn't just make enhance the voters' convenience. It also makes the clerk's life easier by processing this more smoothly and reducing the call volume that they get. But it also makes my job surveilling the election easier. One of the reasons we didn't have vote fraud in this primary is I have a bipartisan task force with other officials in Frankfurt, and we monitor the election. I know in real time if there's an address that requests multiple ballots. So we were able to surveil the system, make sure everything was working. You've disproportionately had election fraud in Kentucky that's been through absentee ballots, which is why I was so cautious about expanding it. But we could expand it because we also have the capability to stop any fraud before it happens. We did have an individual in Owensboro who attempted to vote twice, but we were able to spot that. That wouldn't have been possible under the prior regime with their technology. So all that to say, I think we should make the portal permanent. I also think we should make the cure process permanent. For the first time in Kentucky history, we actually are mandating that the clerks provide a voter who made a mistake in casting an absentee ballot to be contacted and given a chance to correct the error. In 2018, we had 8% of the absentee ballots thrown out for voter error. The voter didn't sign, or the voter didn't seal the envelope, or some other just innocent mistake made by a voter that then disenfranchised the voter. In the primary, even though we went from 2% absentee to 75% absentee, we actually had only a 3% voter error rate, fatal error rate with ballots. That's partly because we, I think, did a good job, and others did too, explain to voters how to vote absentee correctly and not make a mistake, but also through the cure process that we implemented, where if the voter made a mistake, they were contacted and given a shot to go fix the mistake. People make mistakes in person too, but those get caught easier because you're voting in person and the poll worker can help you. It's harder when you're voting remotely. So with the cure process, this doesn't help or hurt a party. This is just helping the voters. So I think definitely we want to make the cure process and the portal permanent.
Great.
But I'll tell you what's off the table is unlimited absentee. That's the most expensive way you can run an election. It's doubled our costs running this election. It's very expensive with all the postage, and I just don't feel confident asking the legislature to cut some other valuable program to pay for expanding that. I'd say that casino gaming has a better chance of passing than no excuse absentee.
Well, you kind of opened the door to politics a little bit there, so I'm going to walk right in and ask you a question in that realm. you've done something unique in Kentucky politics and in national politics, which is you worked with somebody on the other side of the aisle, namely the governor, and you've gotten a lot done by working in this bipartisan manner. Question that I would have for you is, what do you think has been critical to your success in working in a bipartisan manner, and how would you describe the reaction to what you've done, your collaboration with the governor in particular?
The biggest lesson I learned from Wisconsin and Ohio, those are states that voted in the primary before we did, and they had problems. And the biggest problem they had wasn't the administration part of it, it was the politics. You had the Democratic governor of Wisconsin and the Republican legislature of Wisconsin suing each other, and it went to the U.S. Supreme Court. What the election was going to look like became an issue for the U.S. Supreme Court. And they issued a decision, I think it was the day before the primary election in Wisconsin. So that left too little time to have clarity on what the rules were going to be and train the election officials and inform the voters. And so Wisconsin was a total nightmare. People got sick, people got disenfranchised. In Ohio, you had the governor and secretary of state on one side suing, and then the courts striking down the election and then putting it on and putting it off. And you didn't have clarity for the voters, are we supposed to vote or not? So to me, the most important thing that I could do in my position was to be bipartisan for a couple of reasons. Number one, so I could have an agreement reached well in advance of the election and have clarity for the voters, clarity for the poll workers and everybody else, but also to send the signal that this was a legitimate, credible election, that we're not a banana republic. If just Republican Adams wrote the election plan, the Democrats would cry foul and they'd say something doesn't smell right about that. If the governor, a Democrat, had written the election rules, the Republicans would have said, he's trying to steal this race from Mitch McConnell. So to me, it was important to have this with bipartisan buy-in. I think it also led to a better product. I got some things I wanted that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise. One of the reasons I've had so much success getting our voter rolls much more quickly back into compliance with the law is part of this agreement with the governor. I had access to resources I didn't have access to otherwise. I've been able to use toward my own goals of getting our voter rolls cleaned up. So I think you get a better product if it's bipartisan. I think it reflects the interests of both sides, but also it just looks more credible. It shows the voters that we're not a banana republic.
Secretary Adams, do you have time for one more question?
Absolutely.
So this question is, I think a really interesting one. There's been a lot of talk about the legitimacy of U.S. elections. I mean, we touched on this briefly a minute ago. I'll poll number from NBC News that showed that 55% of adults lack confidence in the fairness of the 2020 election. When you hear a statistic like that, what's your initial gut reaction to that? And what do you think is driving that lack of confidence, and how might we address it?
Well, I think that there's a lack of confidence in every aspect of every institution. It's the government, it's religion, organized religion, it's the news media, pretty much every institution today, the public is turning against it. There's just a lack of confidence in institutions generally. And there's just not much I can really do about that. All I can do is my best in my position and try to lead by example. To me, it was important when I ran for this office. My goal was to restore confidence in at least Kentucky's election system. And for me, that meant a photo ID to vote law. It meant cleaning up our voter rolls. It meant personal integrity and a lack of scandal in this office. But the challenge really for me this year has been a different sort of way to solve that lack of confidence, which is to show people that I'm fair and nonpartisan, and this job is almost a quasi-judicial role. You can't play favorites. You've got to be fair. Even if your own party gets upset with you, you've got to do the right thing and work for everybody. So I think I missed a question you just asked a second ago. You asked about the reception of my work with the governor. I think regular folks, common sense folks are pretty happy with it. But I get a lot of negative feedback. I've already drawn a primary opponent for my next election in 2023. I've lost friends. I've lost donors. It's been tough. There's a lot of backlash, and half the backlash is on the specifics of what I've done, which I accept. that people don't like policies. It's fine, doesn't hurt my feelings. But half the backlash is, how can you work with a Democrat? I think that's a really poisonous attitude. I think we've got to be able to at least listen to each other and try to work together if we can. There's going to be plenty of issues that I disagree with the governor on going forward. But that doesn't mean we can't work together when it's in our mutual interest and the public's interest.
Well, Secretary Adams, we certainly appreciate your time, your hard work on behalf of the Commonwealth. I want to give you a minute to kind of have the last word here. But first, I want to thank everybody for attending our call here. I particularly want to thank all of our sponsors, presenting sponsor Norton Healthcare, and supporting sponsors Babbage Co-Founder and Crown Castle. And as a reminder to everybody, please visit some of our election resources on greaterlouisville.com. Of course, I recommend visiting the Secretary of State website. If you're not following the Secretary on Twitter, it's also, I've found to be an excellent resource of information. And it is, in all honesty, probably one of the more entertaining, I think, Twitter accounts out there. It's a really good one. So I recommend giving it a follow as a great way to keep track of what's going on with our elections. Secretary Adams, any last words you'd like to share with GLI's members?
Well, first off, thank you for doing this. I appreciate what you've done, certainly this year, but even before I was Secretary of State, to inform the public. Thank you for doing this. Just real fast, there's 4 convenient ways to vote. It's never been easier. You can vote absentee ballot and mail it back. You can vote absentee ballot and put it in the drop box. Again, the deadline for an absentee ballot request is tonight at midnight. And then you've got 2 other easy ways to vote. You can vote in person on November 3rd, or better yet, you can vote in person before November 3rd. That's what I'm going to do, and that's what I strongly encourage you to do. That's the best release valve for the demand we're going to have on our voting to ensure that we have social distancing and keep people safe and make this as convenient as possible. So don't forget to vote. Gosh, if there's any year that there's no excuse for not voting, it's this year. You've got 19 days to show up and do it. Plus you can vote absentee. So please go vote.
Thank you, Secretary. And again, thank you everybody for attending, and be on the lookout for more GLI events. Everyone have a great afternoon.